Sometimes people tell stories that sound like science fiction. Some claim that for a few minutes they stopped being human altogether and somehow turned into an object, a wall, a chair, or part of the room itself. Others say they suddenly found themselves somewhere completely different, as if their mind had switched channels and tuned into another reality. And some describe encounters with strange entities, or the feeling that their entire life suddenly turned into something like a dream. Stories like these sound so bizarre that it's easy to dismiss them as exaggerations, or imagination, or just internet myths. But what makes these stories interesting is that many of them revolve around the same thing, the same plant. A plant that, for most of human history, was almost completely unknown outside of a small mountainous region of Mexico. Its name is Salvia divinorum. But to understand why it earned that reputation, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the mountains where this story started. The mountains. Where it all began. To understand the history of Salvia divinorum, the first thing you have to do is imagine the place where it originally appeared. Southern Mexico, a region called Oaxaca. And it's probably not what most people picture when they think about Mexico. When people imagine Mexico, they often picture deserts, cacti, dry landscapes, and endless sun. But Oaxaca is something completely different. Here, the land rises into mountains covered in thick green forests. In some areas, the vegetation is so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. The air is humid, the soil is rich, and rain falls frequently. Clouds often drift so low through the mountains that entire valleys disappear into mist. Sometimes the fog hangs there for hours, sometimes for days. This kind of environment creates perfect conditions for plant life. In fact, Oaxaca is considered one of the most biologically diverse regions in North America. Scientists call places like this biodiversity hotspots, areas where nature has produced an extraordinary variety of plant and animal species. Many of the plants growing in these mountains exist nowhere else on Earth. But the story of Salvia divinorum isn't only about plants. It's also about the people who have lived in these mountains for centuries. Because Oaxaca is home to dozens of indigenous cultures that manage to preserve many of their traditions, despite centuries of outside influence. Among them are the Mazatec people, and within Mazatec culture, certain plants were never viewed as just biological organisms. They were something more. Some plants were believed to hold spiritual significance. Others were used for healing, and a few were thought to have the ability to reveal hidden knowledge. Salvia divinorum belonged to that last category. For the Mazatecs, this plant was not something recreational, it wasn't a curiosity, and it definitely wasn't something used casually. Instead, it was part of a ritual tradition that had developed over generations. Mazatec shamans referred to the plant as Hojas de la Pastora. Translated loosely, that means the leaves of the shepherdess. The name is tied to local spiritual beliefs, where the plant was associated with a guiding spirit, something that could help lead a person toward answers. But it's important to understand one key detail. In traditional Mazatec culture, the use of Salvia divinorum was highly structured. It happened under specific conditions, usually at night, often in silence, under the guidance of a healer or shaman who understood the rituals involved. The ceremonies could involve chanting, prayer, and carefully prepared settings designed to help the participant focus inward. The plant was believed to help people seek answers to problems such as illness, emotional distress, or spiritual confusion. To someone from modern Western culture, this might sound unusual, but if you zoom out and look at human history as a whole, the use of plants to alter consciousness in ritual settings is actually incredibly common. Across different cultures and continents, humans have used mushrooms, cacti, vines, tree bark, leaves, and herbs to explore altered states of consciousness. But almost all of these traditions share one important rule. They happen within a structured cultural framework. They aren't random. They're part of a belief system. And for centuries, Salvia divinorum remained part of the Mazatec cultural world. Outside those mountain communities, almost nobody even knew the plant existed. At least, not until the 20th century. How the outside world discovered. Salvia divinorum. For most of its history, Salvia divinorum remained hidden from the outside world. Not because anyone was actively trying to keep it secret, but because the communities that used it lived in remote mountain regions that were difficult for outsiders to reach, and because the rituals involving the plant were deeply embedded in cultural traditions. But in the early 20th century, something began to change. Anthropologists, researchers who study human cultures, started traveling through Mexico to document indigenous traditions. One of those researchers would eventually play a key role in bringing Salvia divinorum to the attention of the wider world. His name was R. Gordon Wasson. Wasson wasn't originally a scientist, he was actually a banker, but he had a deep fascination with the cultural history of mushrooms. Over time, that fascination turned into serious research. In the 1950s, Wasson traveled to Mexico to study indigenous traditions involving psychoactive mushrooms. His work eventually introduced the Western world to the Mazatec mushroom ceremonies. And during those investigations, Wasson heard local healers mention something else. Another plant. A plant used in certain ceremonies when mushrooms weren't available. That plant was Salvia divinorum. At the time, almost nothing was known about it scientifically. Botanists hadn't properly described it, chemists hadn't analyzed it, and very few written records even mentioned it. Intrigued by the reports, Wasson decided to investigate further. In the early 1960s, he traveled to Oaxaca together with a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann. Hofmann is famous for one particular reason. He was the scientist who first synthesized LSD. Together, the two researchers managed to obtain samples of the mysterious plant. Those samples eventually made their way to laboratories. And for the first time, Salvia divinorum entered the world of modern science. At first, researchers were mainly interested in identifying and classifying the plant. They discovered that it belonged to the large plant genus Salvia, a group that includes hundreds of species. Most of those species are completely ordinary. Some are culinary herbs, others are decorative garden plants, and a few have mild medicinal uses. But Salvia divinorum was clearly something different. The question was, why? To answer that question, scientists would have to look much deeper, all the way down to the plant's chemistry, the chemical mystery. When chemists finally began studying Salvia divinorum in detail, they expected to find something familiar. By that point, scientists had already studied many psychoactive plants from around the world, and most of them had one thing in common. They contained alkaloids. Alkaloids are a class of naturally occurring chemical compounds found in many plants. Some of the most famous psychoactive substances known to science belong to this group. For example, morphine, derived from the opium poppy, nicotine found in tobacco, mescaline, found in certain species of cactus. Because of this pattern, researchers initially assumed Salvia divinorum would work the same way. But when they analyzed the plant's chemical composition, they discovered something surprising. The primary active compound inside the leaves was not an alkaloid at all. Instead, the plant contained a molecule that scientists later named salvinorin A. And this compound belonged to a completely different category of chemicals called diterpenes. That alone made the plant unusual. But the real surprise came when researchers began studying how salvinorin A interacts with the brain. Most psychedelic substances affect the brain by interacting with serotonin receptors, particularly one known as the 5-HT2A receptor. This is the mechanism behind substances like LSD and psilocybin. These compounds tend to amplify perception, enhance sensory input, and alter emotional processing. But salvinorin A doesn't work that way. Instead, it activates something called kappa opioid receptors. These receptors are part of a completely different system in the brain. They are involved in regulating things like perception of pain, mood states, responses to stress, certain aspects of sensory interpretation. This difference in mechanism helps explain why the experiences associated with Salvia divinorum are often described as fundamentally different from those produced by classic psychedelics. Instead of simply intensifying perception, the compound appears to disrupt the brain systems responsible for maintaining our sense of spatial orientation and personal identity. In simpler terms, It may interfere with the processes that allow us to feel like we are a stable self existing in a stable world. And when those processes are temporarily altered, the brain may begin constructing reality in completely unexpected ways. That idea fascinated neuroscientists because it suggested that salvia divinorum could offer something extremely valuable for research, a window into how the brain constructs our perception of reality itself. But before scientists could fully explore that possibility, something else happened. Something that dramatically changed how the world perceived this strange plant. The internet discovered it. The strangest experiences. When researchers started collecting reports from people who had encountered salvia divinorum, they noticed something unusual. Even though the individuals often came from completely different backgrounds, many of their descriptions shared striking similarities. People frequently reported sensations that were difficult to put into words. Some described the feeling that the world around them had become two-dimensional, as if reality had flattened into a surface. Others said the environment seemed to fold or ripple like pages in a book being turned. Some individuals reported the sensation that they were no longer inside their bodies at all. Instead, they felt like they had merged with surrounding objects. A wall, a chair, a piece of furniture. Others described something even stranger. They felt as if they had briefly stepped into an entirely different narrative, a different story unfolding somewhere else. Not just seeing it, but being part of it. A few people described these experiences as if they had momentarily lived another life. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the experience would end, and they would find themselves back in the same room where they started. The entire sequence often lasted only a few minutes, but during that time, the brain's interpretation of reality seemed to transform dramatically. For neuroscientists, these reports were fascinating because they hinted at something fundamental about how the brain works. Our everyday perception of the world feels stable and continuous. But in reality, it is constructed moment by networks of neurons processing sensory information. What salvia divinorum seemed to demonstrate was that those networks could be disrupted in ways that produced radically different interpretations of reality. Instead of a stable world with a clear sense of self inside it, the brain could generate completely unfamiliar experiences. This idea raised a deeper question. If our perception of reality is constructed by the brain, then how stable is it really? For decades, salvia divinorum remained mostly within scientific circles and small communities interested in ethnobotany. But everything changed in the early 2000s. This was the era when the internet was rapidly transforming how information spread around the world. Video platforms were becoming popular, social media was emerging, and people were beginning to share personal experiences online in ways that had never been possible before. At some point, videos involving salvia divinorum began appearing on early video sharing websites. The videos followed a similar pattern. Someone would be sitting in a room with friends. After a short time, their behavior would suddenly change. Sometimes they would start laughing uncontrollably. Sometimes they would look around in confusion, as if trying to understand where they were. Occasionally, they would begin speaking to someone who wasn't visible to anyone else in the room. To viewers who had never heard of the plant, these reactions looked strange and unpredictable, and that made the videos extremely shareable. Within a few years, millions of people had watched clips involving salvia divinorum. For the first time in history, a plant that had once been known only to small communities in the mountains of Oaxaca had become part of global internet culture. But this sudden exposure also attracted attention from governments and regulatory agencies, because many authorities realized that a psychoactive plant previously unknown to most of the public was suddenly being discussed everywhere online. And that led to the next chapter in the story: the debate over how to regulate it. Laws, restrictions, and global debate. When salvia divinorum suddenly appeared all over the internet in the early 2000s, governments around the world were caught off guard. For decades, the plant had existed almost entirely outside of legal discussions. It wasn't widely known, it wasn't commonly traded, and most policymakers had never even heard of it. But the internet changed that almost overnight. Suddenly, videos and discussions about Salvia divinorum were circulating globally. News outlets began covering the phenomenon. Journalists wrote articles about a mysterious psychedelic plant. And governments started asking an obvious question. What exactly is this substance and how should it be regulated? The problem was that Salvia divinorum didn't fit neatly into existing categories. Unlike synthetic drugs, it was a naturally occurring plant. Unlike many traditional narcotics, it didn't have a long history of widespread recreational use across multiple societies. And unlike some well-known substances, there was relatively little scientific research available at the time. This created a complicated situation. Different countries responded in different ways. Some governments moved quickly to restrict or ban the plant entirely. Others took a more cautious approach, waiting for additional research before deciding how to handle it legally. As a result, the legal status of Salvia divinorum today varies dramatically around the world. In some countries, possession or sale of the plant is illegal. In others, it may be regulated in specific ways. And in certain regions, its legal status remains unclear or unregulated. These differences often reflect broader debates about how societies should deal with psychoactive substances. Some policymakers focus on potential risks and public safety concerns. Others emphasize scientific research and cultural context. And still others argue that more data is needed before strong regulations should be implemented. In other words, Salvia divinorum became part of a much larger global conversation, one that involves science, law, culture, and public policy. But while governments were debating regulations, scientists were focusing on something else entirely. They were trying to understand what this plant could teach us about the human brain, a plant that rarely grows wild. One of the most surprising facts about Salvia divinorum is that, even today, it is rarely found growing wild in large numbers. Its natural habitat is extremely specific. The plant grows best in humid, shaded environments, often in mountainous regions where the soil is rich and moisture levels remain relatively high. In the forests of Oaxaca, it typically grows near streams or in areas protected by thick vegetation. Direct sunlight can damage the leaves, so the plant often thrives under the cover of larger trees. This type of environment, warm, moist, and partially shaded, is ideal for many tropical plants. But Salvia divinorum has another unusual characteristic. It rarely produces viable seeds. Instead, it typically spreads through vegetative reproduction, meaning new plants grow from pieces of existing ones. In practical terms, that means a cutting from one plant can grow into a genetically identical new plant. This detail may seem minor, but it has major implications. Because of this reproductive pattern, many scientists believe that most Salvia divinorum plants found outside Mexico today are descendants of only a few original specimens collected decades ago. Once researchers obtained samples in the 20th century, the plant was gradually cultivated in controlled environments, such as botanical gardens, university greenhouses, research laboratories. These environments allowed scientists to study the plant more closely. Over time, it also meant that Salvia divinorum could be grown in climates far outside its original habitat, as long as temperature and humidity conditions were carefully controlled. But even with cultivation, the plant has remained relatively rare compared to many other species in the Salvia genus. And that rarity has contributed to its reputation as one of the more mysterious plants studied by modern science. Why scientists are still studying it? Despite decades of research, Salvia divinorum remains a topic of interest in several scientific fields. The main reason is the compound salvinorin A. As mentioned earlier, this molecule is chemically unusual and interacts with the brain in ways that differ from most known psychoactive substances. For neuroscientists, this makes it extremely valuable, because understanding how different molecules affect the brain can help researchers map the complex systems that produce consciousness, perception, and emotional experience. Salvinorin A specifically interacts with kappa opioid receptors. These receptors are part of a broader system that helps regulate how the brain processes stress, mood, and certain sensory signals. Studying this system could potentially provide insights into conditions such as depression, anxiety, chronic pain, stress-related disorders. Researchers are particularly interested in how this receptor system influences perception and mood regulation. By studying compounds that interact with it, scientists hope to better understand the underlying mechanisms of these processes. This doesn't mean Salvia divinorum itself is being widely developed as a treatment, but the molecular pathways involved could inspire future medical research. In other words, a plant once used in small ceremonial traditions in the mountains of Mexico has now become part of a much broader scientific effort to understand the brain. And that leads to the final question in this story. Why does a single plant generate so much fascination? A window into consciousness. Throughout human history, plants have shaped our understanding of the world in unexpected ways. Some gave us food, others became medicine, and a few revealed something deeper about how the human mind works. Salvia divinorum belongs to that last category. Its story stretches from the mist-covered forests of Oaxaca to modern laboratories studying the chemistry of the brain, from small ceremonial traditions to global conversations about science, law, and culture. But perhaps the most interesting part of this story isn't the plant itself. It's what the plant reveals about us. Because every unusual experience reported with Salvia divinorum ultimately raises the same question. How does the brain construct the reality we experience every day? Our perception of the world feels stable and continuous, but science increasingly suggests that this sense of reality is something the brain actively builds from sensory information. Change the signals, change the interpretation, and the entire experience of reality can shift. Salvia divinorum doesn't just alter perception. It reminds us that perception itself is a fragile and complex process, a process that scientists are still trying to understand. And that may be the real reason this small, unassuming plant continues to fascinate researchers and storytellers alike. Because sometimes the most ordinary-looking things in nature turn out to hold the deepest questions about the human mind. A small dose of the past to understand the present. See you in the next story.